Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
And welcome into the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network Team Autopsy Report. Folks, we have the Vanderbilt Commodores on the autopsy table this morning, and I'm extremely excited about talking about this team because, one, they're here in my backyard, so I get to see a little bit more of what's going on behind the scenes than most would. So I feel like I have a really good idea of not only where this program is trying to come from, but actually where they're trying to go. So I'll give a little bit of the backstory here and really take a look at where this program has been, and it's been one of the worst programs in college football. We understand that. But with the change in athletic director and a actual commitment not only to the football program, upgrading the facilities, really renovating that stadium, it's been a renewed sense of commitment to their entire sports landscape. We're seeing the benefits of being in a major conference and all of that additional television revenue and support. Vandy's actually starting to implement that into the football program. So that's something that we have to evaluate. Let's start right here with the head coach, Clark Lee. Back at his alma mater, played here with the Commodores, and now getting a chance to coach at his alma mater. When we look at his record on the surface, in 4 seasons, you will see 16 wins, 33 losses, win percentage of 32%, we'll call it. You would think that would be a coach firmly on the hot seat. However, that's why I told you about the deep dive behind the situations. So look at it this way. In his first 3 years as the head coach, he won a total of 9 games. Last year alone, 7 games. And in those 7 wins, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about some very impressive wins there. So it gave not only the fan base something to get excited about, but also the donors something to get excited about. So we have to look at their progress in a little bit different scale here. If this is your first time joining us, welcome aboard. If you've been with us, thank you as well. If you're watching on YouTube and Twitter, you'll see a lot of the data that I'm going to be referencing here. For those of you listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't worry. Everything that I'm going to mention that will be on the screen, I got you covered with that. Let's talk about the season betting win total. Folks, you could have gotten the Vanderbilt Commodores at 2.5 back in June last year. If you would have taken that over, this would have been the easiest future ticket you would have ever cashed in your entire betting career. This team absolutely blew that out of the water by winning 6 games in the regular season last year, and easily, and I do mean easily, could have won more. Now, let's take a deeper dive into our in-season composite win total here. And when I look at that number, we actually had the Commodores at a 6.8. So this team actually, by our metrics, should have been a 7-win team. I'm going to be able to point out to you very specifically which game I felt like they absolutely could have won, just came up a little bit short there. Speaking of schedule, there are 2 different schedule factors that we look at, both equally, your strength of schedule and your strength of record. Now, when you play in a big-time conference, you only control 25% of your schedule as far as who is going to be on it. Your in-conference schedule, you have no control over. That's just a random luck of the draw. It's your non-conference. Who do you schedule out of conference? Do you step up in weight class, or do you kind of schedule some group of 6 and FCS opponents to really kind of beef up that win total there? The Commodores had a .551 strength of schedule, 14th toughest in college football last year. So this 6 wins that they had came against some really good opponents last year. As far as their strength of record, basically to kind of sum that up, the way we look at it is your opponent's winning percentage, .583, 31st in college football last year. So again, playing a really challenging schedule where their opponents were winning a lot of games last year. Now, let's pull up the first graphic here for those of you watching on YouTube or are streaming us on our Twitter feed at Crunch Time VIP. Virginia Tech ended the regular season last year 6-6, stepped out and played an FCS opponent in Alcorn State. That's important for a team like Vandy to at least get that win under their belt. Then played Georgia State. Georgia State was 3-9 last year. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. Missouri was 9-3. Alabama was 9-3. Upset win over Alabama, I should say. Kentucky was 4-8. Ball State was 3-9 last year. Texas 11-1. Auburn 5-7. South Carolina 9-3. LSU was 8-4, and then Tennessee was 10-2. I said I would mention a game that they absolutely could have won but came up short. Now, most would look at that game against Texas where they lost that by 3 points, 27-24. And while I give that a lot of merit, the game that I'm going to go back to that they absolutely let get away was that Georgia State game. A team that finished the regular season with 3 wins, and you lose that game 36-32. If Vanderbilt wins that game, we're now cooking with a whole set of different hot grease there. Now, let's talk about the quality of defenses that Vanderbilt offense went up against last year. We use a baseline number of 68 because that's how many Power 4 teams there were last year. And we're just going to look at how many of their opponents were inside of that top 68. Virginia Tech, 28th power defense last year. Missouri was 20th. Alabama was 6th. Kentucky was 13th. Texas was 2nd. Auburn was 39th. South Carolina was 7th. LSU was 29th, and Tennessee was 3rd. 9 of their opponents were inside of that 68. Now, we got to mention this. 2 of their opponents were outside of that top 100. Georgia State, 101st power ranked defense. That's why I highlighted that game. When you look at not only Georgia State's record, but their defense, Vandy let that one slip through their fingers. And then Ball State, 132nd out of 134 teams last year, did get that win. You're talking about an average power ranking for Vandy's opponents having a defensive ranking of about 35th. Week in and week out, you're playing a team that's roughly in that 7-5, 8-4 range there. So they faced a really, really challenging schedule. And I think that's going to show in their advanced metrics when we get to that in here in just a moment. So for the offense, I'm going to give you the NCAA average, Vandy's, what we call accounting stats numbers, what you're going to see on any reference website. And then we're going to give you our number for Vandy in that category when we adjust that based on their opponent. So average team last year scored 28 points per game. Vanderbilt, 26.7. So basically right there at the average. But when we adjust for the opponents, 28.4. So just a tick better than what the average team from a scoring standpoint goes last year. As far as passing offense, 227 yards per game passing is what the average team had. Vanderbilt, 180 yards per game. That's their accounting stat number. When we adjust for opponent, it goes up to 215 yards per game. 34 yard per game improvement there. Still a little bit below the average, but much closer to that average number last year. And as far as rushing yards per game, 160 yards per game. Vanderbilt, a raw accounting stats numbers show 139. When we adjust for opponent, goes up to 157 yards per game. So again, right there on the average when we start adjusting for opponent. And then total offense per game, 387 yards per game. Now, on the surface, Vanderbilt was 319 yards per game. But like I said, when we adjust for opponent, we see a 52 yard per game improvement to 371 yards. So given the quality of defenses that they faced against, this Vanderbilt offense was much better than what their statistical numbers will show. This is why we do our numbers based on the advanced metrics and not just their raw accounting stats. Diving deep into the offensive numbers here. Average team scoring drives last year, either touchdown or field goal, 40%. The Commodores were at 52%. Fantastic there for a team that only won 6 games. As far as drives ending with a touchdown, average team last year, 29%. The Commodores, 33.7%. Again, improvement. And their third down conversion, average team last year, 39%. The Commodores, adjusted third down conversion rate, 46%. Now, this team did a great job of protecting the quarterback. 15 sacks allowed last year. That's almost 9 better than what the average team allowed last year, and committed 7 turnovers. That's winning football. So you're talking about, why did this team only win 6 games last year? Well, that's when we dive deep into the metrics here, looking at their 3 E's on offense, how effective, explosive, and efficient their offense was last year. As far as effectiveness last year, Vanderbilt was 35th. As far as explosive plays on offense, 68th. And as far as efficiency, they were 44th. The Commodores ended the regular season as our 50th ranked offense in college football last year. Now, let's take a look at the defensive split breakdown here. And again, we're going to use that baseline of 68. Virginia Tech's offense was 34th. Missouri was 53rd. Alabama, number 2. Texas, number 6. Auburn, 56th. South Carolina, 19th. LSU, 21st ranked offense, and Tennessee was 26th. So 8 of their opponents were inside of that top 68. an average power ranking of about 43. So about that same caliber of offense on a week in and week out basis, probably about in that 7-5 range there for Vanderbilt. Let's take a look at their defensive metrics, and I'm going to give you their accounting stat number and then our adjusted number. Points per game allowed, 23 points per game. We adjust that for opponent, goes down to 19.4. So about a 4-point improvement there. As far as passing yards per game allowed, 238 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, improves to 232. So about 6 yards improvement there. Their rush defense was really solid last year. 137 yards per game allowed. When we adjust that for opponent, goes down to 126. So we're seeing a lot of improvement there, adjusting for opponent. And then total offense per game allowed, 375 yards per game. When we adjust that finally for opponents, 358. So a little bit better than the average team was last year. This team, as far as their opponents' drives ending with a score, either a touchdown or field goal, about 35%. So still better than the average team last year. As far as their opponents' drives ending with a touchdown, 26%. Again, about a 3 percentage point improvement there. And as far as their opponents converting on third downs, now here's where we didn't see the improvement. Their opponents converting on third downs at 43%. So a regression of about 4 percentage points based on what the average team was last year. Did an okay job of getting after the opponent's quarterback, 21 sacks. The average team had about 24 last year. And fourth down defense, 50% is what their opponents converted, 7 out of 14. So solid job there. Forcing turnovers, this team forced 14 turnovers. Now, again, you're probably asking yourself, how does this team finish 6-6? When we get to the 3 E's, I think that may spell it out for you. As far as effective defense, Vanderbilt was 78th. As far as giving up explosive plays, they were 76th. As far as efficiency goes, they were 59th. The Vanderbilt Commodores ended the regular season as our 70th ranked defense from an overall standpoint. Their special teams, we're going to say above average. And the reason we say just above average, I'll get to here in just a second. The field goal kicking unit was absolutely spectacular. 16 out of 19, that's 84% there. Made all but one of their extra point attempts in the games that we were tracking, but the punting game was the issue. Average 4 punts per game, but only 39.9 yards per punt. That's 119th out of 134 teams. So that's why they get just the above average and not more of a better breakdown there. As far as the coaching and situational play, this team was +7 in the turnover differential. That is winning football, no question about it. This team was absolutely very disciplined. Just 5.1 penalties per game, about a penalty less than the average team last year, and only 49 yards in penalty last year. That is phenomenal. Now, in one-score games last year, Clark Lee was 3-4 there, and against quality opponents, 4-5. As far as Coach Lee and his aggressive nature going for it on fourth downs, 8.8% of the time. That ranks 127th out of 144 qualifying coaches last year at the D1 level, which makes sense because they were 7 out of 13 going for it on fourth down. So right at the average of about 54%. Now let's take a look at their quarterback, Diego Pavia, in 13 games last year. 59% completion percentage. Oh, not good. 177 completions, 298 attempts, 2,293 yards passing. So that breaks down to about 176 yards per game passing. 20 touchdowns, 4 INTs. We do love the touchdown to INT ratio. 1.3% of Pavia's pass attempts were intercepted. You can absolutely win ball games with that number. Now, what made Pavia really special was what he gave you in the ground game. 192 attempts, 801 yards rushing, 4.2 yards per rushing attempt, 8 touchdowns. So when you add up what he gave you as a passer and averaging about 62 yards per game on the ground, you're looking at a quarterback that gave you about 230 yards per game in total offense. While that's not eye-popping, that is quality football because your quarterback's not turning the ball over at a very high rate. So when you get that kind of consistent quarterback play, you're going to be in a lot of games, which Vanderbilt absolutely was last season. Now, let's take a look at the offensive and defensive splits in the games that they won versus the games that they lost. In their 6 wins, the Commodores averaged about 32 points per game, 184 yards per game, passing on just 21 attempts. That's a 9 yards per attempt pass attempt average. That is absolutely excellent. If you're a college team and you're anywhere north of 8.5 yards per attempt, that's extremely, extremely high level. 13.8 yards per completion. Again, that's high level yards per completion there. Your receivers are making some yards after the catch, and you love that as an offensive coordinator. 42 rushing attempts per game in those victories, 161 yards per game rushing, 3.8 yards per rushing attempt. While not great, it was the fact that they could control the pace of the game that way. 63 plays per game when they won. That is phenomenal there. 344 yards per game in total offense, 5.5 yards per play. The third down conversion, absolutely phenomenal. 51% conversion on third downs and just 1 turnover in those 6 wins. In their 6 losses, 22 points per game, 177 yards per game passing, but now the attempts go up to 27 attempts per game, 6.6 yards per attempt. That's well below average there. 12.3 yards per completion. The rushing attempts go down to 31 per game, just 118 yards per game rushing. Again, 3.8 yards per rushing attempt. 57 plays per game for 295 yards, 5.1 yards per play. So again, I said this offense was not explosive. It, however, was efficient in their wins. 35% conversion rate on third downs. That was problematic. And then the 6 turnovers in those 6 losses. So not a lot of turnovers in those losses, but the fact that they really couldn't control the pace of the game in those losses. Now, let's take a look at the defensive splits here. In those 6 wins, the defense was allowing 16 points per game. Their opponents, 208 yards per game passing on 26 attempts, 7.9 yards per attempt, 12 yards per completion. Solid numbers there. Not elite, but very solid. Their opponents attempted 27 rushing attempts per game, but only 88 yards rushing, 3.3 yards per rushing attempt. That is elite. Their opponents were only running 53 plays per game. I like that number going into this upcoming season. 297 yards per game in total offense, 5.6 yards per play. Their opponents converting on third downs at a 35% clip in those wins, and this defense forced 8 total turnovers. In the 6 losses, 30 points per game allowed. Their opponents' yards per game balloon up to 268 yards per game on 33 attempts, 8.1 yards per passing attempt, 11.8 yards per completion. The rushing attempts go up by about almost 12 attempts per game to 38, and the rushing yardage goes up significantly, 185 yards per game rushing, 4.8 yards per rushing attempt. Their opponent opponents were running 71 plays per game, 453, let's call it 454 yards per game, 6.4 yards per play. Their opponents on third downs converting at a 60% clip. That's why you lose 6 games there. You cannot get off the field on third downs. And only 6 forced turnovers there for the Commodores defense. So we're looking at a defensive unit that when they lost was getting carved up through the air and on the ground. Almost 157 yards per game allowed difference in their losses compared to their wins. In our final couple of moments, let's go ahead and give you what went wrong for this team, and then we'll get to the final grade and the final verdict. So what went wrong for Vandy? We talked about it, struggling against the pass last year, failure to finish drives from an offensive standpoint, and then inconsistencies from their defensive performances week in and week out. And we highlighted that, giving up that amount of points to a team like Georgia State, really problematic there. So let's go ahead and get to the final verdict, and then we're going to give you some keys for the Vanderbilt Commodores in 2025 if they want to continue to build on what we saw last year. The Vanderbilt Commodores in 2024 will get a final grade of a B-. What we saw from Vandy in the final verdict: Vandy exceeded preseason expectations, but struggled at times against some of the better opponents. Their run game and special teams kept them in games, but inconsistent executions prevented them from reaching their full potential. Vandy faced another tough season in the SEC, struggling to keep up with competition in most areas. Now, they were able to pull off major upsets. I mentioned the game against Alabama. Absolute shocker here when they got that win at home. Almost pulled off another upset against Texas, which would have been absolutely mind-blowing there. And then having the lead for most of that game against Tennessee, but then ran out of gas there late in the second quarter and just could not finish getting over the hump. If Vandy hopes to take another step forward in 2025, they have to focus on recruiting, player development, and establishing a more competitive identity in those games, especially when we get later in the season when depth on your roster becomes a significant issue. So in our final minute and a half, I'm going to give you 3 important keys for the Vanderbilt Commodores for 2025. 1, they must develop more offensive firepower. Vandy needs more playmakers on offense if they're going to stay competitive, whether it's in the run game or at the receiving position. And I don't just mean receivers. I mean receivers, tight ends, backs that can catch the ball out of the backfield. Key number 2, got to strengthen that defense. When we're talking about strengthening the defense, improving the tackling and preventing the big plays must be a priority for head coach Clark Lee going into 2025. And then the final key, I mentioned it, enhance the recruiting and player development. You're coming off a really good year. Building depth in your roster is going to be critical for long-term success. It's hitting the transfer portal and going to like the MAC or the American Conference, pulling in some of those guys and building up your second and third string level depth there. So when your starters come out, you're not seeing the major drop off in talent from your starters to your second team. When you play in a conference where you're going to be tested week in and week out, having that depth on your roster is absolutely paramount if you want to continue to see those wins go up. And we saw it, Vandy ended the season losing 4 out of their last 5 games. Depth had a big issue to do with that. If the Commodores focus on these 3 areas, this team will increase their competitiveness and see that win total. If not, stay the same, absolutely improve in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at crunchtimesportsadvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.